Okay, so thank you very much to the organizers for putting together this wonderful session, and thanks for the opportunity to give some of my thoughts on industrial policy. So I want to do two things, basically, in my opening remarks. First of all, I'd like to talk about the way in which new sort of rigorous, predominantly empirical work in economics is shading, and I would say challenging, the traditional view of IP that has prevailed in the field for a long time, which is that industrial policy is almost always doomed to fail. In a review paper with Dani and our co-author Nathan Lane last year, we sort of looked at this new evidence, and the title of the paper became The New Economics of Industrial Policy, I think partly to really kind of signify this break in what we see as our understanding of important individual episodes of industrial policy. So that's the first thing I want to talk about. Now, if you buy into some of these findings, this is going to raise an interesting and new question, which is that if we move to a world in which industrial policy can sometimes be a force for positive change, this, of course, raises a second question, which is, well, how do we get industrial policy right? What are the characteristics of industrial policy in which the cards are stacked in favor of success? And what are the characteristics of industrial policy in which the cards are stacked in favor of failure? And I think as economists, our sort of natural inclination is to think about sort of, what are the sectors, what are the activities that industrial policy should be targeting, or what is sort of the right policy mix? Should we be doing, import substitution, or should we be doing export-oriented policy? And of course, all of these things are important. I don't want to sort of diminish them, but what I think is very important, and where I think kind of surprisingly there's very little new work on industrial policy, is how to think about the political economy. And so the second thing I want to talk about is that we want to take seriously political economy to explain sort of variation in the industrial policies that we see, variation in success, and to use sort of the insights of modern political economy to maybe also help design, from a normative perspective, how we should be doing industrial policy better in the future, or right now, as well, we know that there's great need for this right now. Okay, so let me talk about my first point. I, of course, don't have time to sort of take you through this new emerging literature in its entirety. Let me tell you a little bit about what this new literature does and what I wish it would do a little bit more, and where I think there's definitely more scope to do more. So I think what has been surprising, at least to me, even though I was sort of vaguely aware of many of these papers and knew them, the exercise of being forced to sort of sit down and collect them all together really made me appreciate the extent to which sort of multiple important episodes of industrial policy, when sort of evaluated systematically with kind of frontier research designs, kind of as Laura was alluding to at the end of her talk, show actually pretty optimistic, positive findings. For the most part, these are local effects. So where I wish we had more evidence was, I wish more papers would be able to speak to the aggregate effects. But I think it's already important to point out that both in sort of advanced economies like the US through the 20th century, but also importantly in places where we have much lower capacity environments, industrial policy seems to have elicited behavioral responses that were consistent with the desires of the policymaker. It shifted economic activity consistent with what policymakers intended to do. It increased productivity, it increased exports. in some cases, we have some evidence suggesting that these were, on the aggregate, beneficial for the economy too. Let me point out sort of two, I think, important lower capacity environments where new work has pointed to an important role for industrial policy. One is sort of a canonical example of industrial policy, which is the HCI shock in Korea. This was an effort by the dictatorship of Park Chung-hee to shift the economy from light industry into heavy industry. Korea was a small, poor economy. This was kind of fantastical. The World Bank wasn't willing to give loans for these projects. Yet, new work is showing that indeed this seemed to have been an important turning point in Korea's history, and the effects, both at the local, so both in the reduced form and at the aggregate level, seem to have been positive. Another example that I really like are two separate job market papers from this year that look at the extraordinary intervention in the Mezzogiorno. So this is interventions in the south of economy. These are place-based industrial policies looking to kickstart manufacturing in lagging regions. Here as well, I think a lot of conventional wisdom would tell you that we've poured money, or not we, but Italian taxpayers have poured money, and the EU more recently has poured money into the south to no avail. This new work suggests that there may have been positive impacts. So the first takeaway, I think, is that, of course, we should be using the bread and butter tools of our profession to evaluate these policies. And it's refreshing to see us do a lot of this in recent years. Yet if we accept that industrial policy can succeed in important cases, and of course fail in others, the second natural question to ask is, well, how do we think about what drives variation? And so this is where I'm going to say something that is in no way novel. It, of course, echoes a lot of what Laura was already saying. Political economy is key, and we're obviously not the first to point this out. The sort of political economy criticism, the political economy skepticism around industrial policy is really as old as industrial policy itself. This is an early 20th century cartoon that is alluding to the fact that infant industry, this is the metaphorical infant industry that you see here, infant industry often becomes code for protected privileges. Okay, and when you sort of think about why the profession has been so skeptical of industrial policy in the past, the political economy challenges are really what have always been central to our criticisms of industrial policy. Be they the informational problems that the government doesn't have the necessary knowledge to find where the market failures in the economy are, be they the political capture problems. But if you sort of take this view seriously, really, I think the way that I understand our traditional view of industrial policy is that by design, in a completely deterministic and fatalistic way, our impression has been that by definition, the government failure involved in trying to do industrial policy is going to be bigger than the market failure that it seeks to correct or that it seeks to alleviate. So put differently, the cure of industrial policy is always going to be worse than the disease. And this is where I think in the work that we're trying to advance with Nathan Lane, we want to sort of bring a more modern political economy and the insights of modern political economy to a serious sort of discussion of the political economy of industrial policy. So we're about to put out a draft of this paper that I'm not going to have time to delve into details of, but really the thesis that we're trying to advance in that paper is that an important component of when industrial policy is likely to succeed is when it is pursued within governance constraints. So what do we mean by that? We think of two important governance constraints. One are political constraints, that is taking the political environment, the local political environment that policymakers are operating in seriously, and working within the state capacity constraints that shape the policymakers' ability to do implementation well. Why are these important? Well, because take take the East Asia growth miracle, in which I think one of the lessons that we've learned is that to the extent that industrial policy was successful in the East Asia growth miracle, it was because economies like Taiwan and Korea pursued export-oriented industrial strategies. The question, of course, is, well, why didn't other countries adopt these export-oriented industrial strategies? Why did they stay stuck in import substituting industrialization? So one case study we look at in the paper is the case study of Thailand, which did try to mimic a lot of what Korea was doing, but the political constraints, the political environment was very different in Thailand. Whereas in Korea, the overvalued exchange rate caused balance of payments problems. The US was exerting a lot of pressure in devaluing the exchange rate. The situation in Thailand was different. There were a lot of political interests that wanted to keep the ISI system in place. The overvalued exchange rate wasn't creating balance of payments problems. And so even though the Thai policymakers were trying to push export promotion, they couldn't do it. They just ended up not being able to dismantle the ISI system. So, while these things sound sort of, I think, obvious, I think these are actually really important to keep in mind when we think about what are the policies that are workable. The last example that I'm going to leave you with is to think about what is the reason why the first major climate legislation that the US government, the US federal government has been able to pass has been a green industrial policy, as opposed to what we economists have been advocating for decades, which is a first best carbon pricing. The answer, a big part of the answer in our view, are the political constraints. Carbon pricing is simply a non-starter today in the US. The Inflation Reduction Act, by creating political constituencies for green industries, the bet of the Biden administration is that this is going to make potentially future climate policies viable by creating political constituents that may win, that may benefit from future carbon pricing policies. So when we think about sort of what are the policies that are workable, it is very important to keep these things in mind. Let me give you a couple of takeaways. First of all, like I said, one important thing that we think is crucial as we think about how to do industrial policy well is successful industrial policy works within the local political environment and within state capacity constraints. That doesn't mean that policymakers should take these constraints as sort of immutable. In fact, as with the example of the IRA, thoughtful industrial policy and thoughtful economic policies are ones that are introduced with an eye towards relaxing future constraints. So the Inflation Reduction Act may well pave the road for carbon pricing in the future. And in a similar way, every successful episode of industrial policy that we have looked at in this paper with Nathan shows governments investing aggressively in state capacity. Yes, you have to work with the state capacity that you have, but state capacity is also an investment. So Korea, and this is the last thing I will say, Korea during the HCI shock, at the beginning of the HCI shock, had terrible state capacity by any measure. It was mired in corruption. The government was weak. How did they pull off the developmental state that entire books have been written about since then? It didn't fall from the sky. Policymakers invested in it. And this is also what we see happening with the Inflation Reduction Act today, whereby the Biden administration is aggressively investing in the capacity, in the state capacity to build this out. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Our next panelist is Greg Mankiw.
Thank you. I do not have slides, so you'll just have to look at my face. Thank you for organizing this session. I think it's tremendously important, especially given policy that we've seen in the United States over the past few years, in particular I'm thinking of the CHIPS Act and the badly misnamed Inflation Reduction Act. I think those are both examples of industrial policy. So what I'd like to do today is give you 3 reasons to favor industrial policy and 1 big reason not to. And then you can decide how to weigh these different effects. I think the first case for industrial policy is a narrow economic case. And that is if you think that there are certain industries, firms that have particularly large externalities, say knowledge spillovers, then then you might think, ah, yes, we should subsidize those. You know, this goes back to a comment, I think it was Michael Boskin who said, I don't care whether we make computer chips or potato chips. But if you think that there's more externalities associated with computer chips than potato chips, then maybe you want to tilt the playing field in favor. I'm kind of skeptical of that one, in part because I do believe that there are knowledge externalities, but I think they tend to be more global than they are national. And so that doesn't particularly make a case for national policy. I think you sort of one example of that. You know, one of the big firms now that's really the center of a lot of industrial policy now is Taiwan Semiconductor, and I'll talk about that. The history of Taiwan Semiconductor was not founded by somebody from Taiwan. It was founded by somebody from China who came to the United States. He worked for Texas Instruments, was passed over for a promotion, was pissed and went to Taiwan and started Taiwan Semiconductor, which is now the leading manufacturer of high-end semiconductors. So I'm sure he took some knowledge from having worked at Texas Instruments to create a new company, but obviously that spillover didn't respect national borders. So I think the narrow economic case involving knowledge spillovers is probably not that compelling. I think somewhat more compelling is the case based on second best, which we just heard about it a minute ago. For global climate change, absolutely the first best policy is a carbon tax. I don't think that anybody serious who's thought about this has come out saying it's a bad idea. I think there's a lot of economists who are in favor of a carbon tax, including, by the way, Secretary Yellen, who before she was secretary signed up with the Climate Leadership Council plan. There's no constituency among politicians. The American Economic Association loves the carbon tax, but outside of that little group, there's really not a lot of support for it. The Republicans don't like any taxes. Actually, by the way, I've been told by people who work for Donald Trump that he doesn't even believe in climate change, so he doesn't even want to think about this issue. Joe Biden has said he's not going to raise taxes on anybody making less than $400,000 a year, and so basically so a carbon tax is a non-starter. And so you might say, oh well, since we can't have a carbon tax, let's do something second best. Let's, instead of taxing bad stuff, let's subsidize good stuff like electric cars and so on. And that's what the Inflation Reduction Act does. It subsidizes a variety of clean activities. But of course, that's very far second best. No, you can't get close to the first best. The carbon tax raises revenue that you then use to cut other taxes. These subsidies require revenue, so you got to raise other taxes, and you can't even hit all margins of adjustment. So this issue is like, how close do you live to work? That affects your carbon footprint. We can't regulate that. So the second best case is, I think, a plausible argument, but very far second best, not a close second best. The third argument for industrial policy, and I think this is the one that's actually getting the most attention now, is national defense. And this was very explicit when Gina Raimondo basically awarded several $1 billion to Taiwan Semiconductor to expand their facilities in Arizona. Kind of amazing. The U.S. federal government is handing a check for several $1 billion to a foreign company. And it's not something we normally expect to do. And you kind of understood the reason why they did that. I mean, actually, if you're interested in the semiconductor industry, I strongly recommend the book Chip War by Chris Miller. He's an historian at Tufts. It's a really fascinating history of the semiconductor industry. And it makes it very clear that Taiwan Semiconductor is the place to manufacture high-end chips. We have manufacturing facilities here, like Intel, but they don't do high-end chips. They can't do the high-end chips. They're really doing old-fashioned stuff. We have places that design high-end chips, like NVIDIA, but then they go to Taiwan to make them. So if you design them, but you can't manufacture them, that's a problem. And I think what people like Gina Raimondo and President Biden are thinking about is like, gosh, the war in Ukraine has told us that we live in a pretty dangerous world. A few years ago, it's hard to imagine a land war in Europe. Now it's there. A few years ago, it's hard to imagine China really trying to take over Taiwan, but it's actually something to think about. I think that's one of the reasons why they basically don't really feel comfortable trusting Taiwan Semiconductor in Taiwan. I've heard from somebody who says they know. I don't know if this is actually true. Somebody who claims they know that Taiwan Semiconductor has plans that if China actually takes over Taiwan, they will destroy their own factories. They'd rather have the factories be destroyed than have them taken over by the Chinese. Well, I don't know if that's true, but either way, whether Taiwan Semiconductor is taken over by the Chinese or just destroyed, That is a big supply shock of major proportions. And I think that is the main motivation and probably the best case, I think, for industrial policy. Okay, so those are my three arguments for favoring industrial policy. And let me just now turn to the main case against it. And this brings me to what I think is the most dangerous person in economics. The most dangerous person in economics is the intelligent, benevolent social planner. And the reason I think he's so dangerous is because he doesn't exist. And there's this quote from the old movie. It says, the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Well, I think the second greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing a lot of economists that the benevolent social planner exists. Because in our classrooms, we say, oh, what would a benevolent social planner do? And they say, we figured out what the right policy is. And the truth is we don't have benevolent, intelligent social planners. And so what I want to do is, so what do we have? What do we have instead of the benevolent social planner? Think of the person who's implementing this as some amalgam of Joe Biden, Donald Trump, Chuck Schumer, Mitch McConnell, and throw in a little bit of AOC and Marjorie Taylor Greene. That's who we have. Okay, so when you're talking about industrial policy, we're going to give these people the idea to reshape the economy. Okay. Now, what's wrong with that amalgam of social planners? Well, I think there's two basic problems with this amalgam. One is they have a pretty poor understanding of business and economics, and especially international economics. I mean, Larry Summers, during his in the Biden administration, was quoted as having said, the government is a crappy venture capitalist, and I think that's probably right. And I think he was referring to a lot of the stuff they were doing, like Cylinder and other sort of subsidies to sort of green companies. I have a friend who's actually a venture capitalist, and he's investing in a variety of green technologies. One of the things his business model is he gets smart professors at MIT and Harvard and engineering professors, and basically throws a lot of money at them, hoping that they'll make a lot of money back from him in 10 years. So one of the things he's invested in is Commonwealth Fusion, who thinks they're going to make electricity from fusion in our lifetime. Seems to be pie in the sky, but he's investing lots of money in that. And so I'd much rather have my venture capitalist friend figuring out which companies to back rather than some bureaucrat in the Commerce Department. The other thing I think that's fundamentally misunderstood is the basic economics of international trade. Think back to Adam Smith. Adam Smith was fighting against mercantilism. We're still fighting against mercantilism. Right? Think of all the stuff that Donald Trump did with tariffs. They see a trade deficit, that's a bad thing. That's probably our fault, calling it a trade deficit. Nobody likes deficits, right? Deficit sounds like a negative word, but I think this idea that, exports are good and imports are the burden we have to bear so we can export stuff, I think that's a common view in Washington. And I think it pervades a lot of policy. To tell you one personal story, when I was working for President Bush, I only showed him one equation in my 2 years there. We were giving a briefing on international economics and trade issues. And the equation I showed him, and maybe this was a mistake, but anyway, the equation I showed him was NX equals S minus I. Which of course we all recognize as a basic identity. So I was trying to sort of talk about, you can't do anything about trade deficits without thinking about capital flows, and these things are integrally connected. So after the presentation was over, one of the people in the room was Steve Hadley, who was the number two, at the time he was the number 2 person in the National Security Council. When Condi Rice became Secretary of State, he became the number 1 person at the National Security Council. Anyway, so Steve Hadley came up to me and said, he's referring to my equation, NX equals S minus I. He says, that's an interesting theory, Greg. I'm not sure if I buy it. so that is that's sort of the nature. That's sort of the level of understanding of international economics. So I think that's one of the things. The policymakers really don't understand international economics very well. And the second problem is politicians have a tendency to be political. And so they don't even want to be intelligent, benevolent social planners. They have other goals in mind. And as a result, you see sort of bad policies existing and persisting. To give you one example of an industrial policy, this is an old industrial policy. In 1954, they passed an act to subsidize domestic mohair producers. And it was a national defense issue because mohair was used to make uniforms for the military. And they were afraid we didn't have domestic mohair producers, when we got to a big war, what would we do? Well, It turned out by 1960, they had figured out synthetic materials for uniforms. So they didn't need mohair anymore. But it took 33 years to repeal the mohair subsidies after that, because the mohair producers liked their subsidies, they kept getting them. So this is sort of an example of sort of bad policies can persist for a long time. Well, let me sort of close with sort of what's going on right now. Joe Biden came out opposed to the Japanese company buying US steel, right? Let's not check. Japan is one of our allies. So why would we be concerned? And then it's not like they were going to close down US steel. They're just going to own it and operate it in the United States. Why were they opposed to that? Well, the Steelworkers Union didn't like the idea of working for the Japanese. So he came out opposed to that in Pennsylvania, which of course is a swing state. The week after he came out against the Japanese buying US steel, the Steelworkers Union in the United States endorsed him for president. I don't know if you saw today's Wall Street Journal, front page story in today's Wall Street Journal is Joe Biden coming out in favor of higher tariffs on Chinese steel because the Chinese are selling us steel too cheaply. And it's an example of what's often referred to as anti-dumping, which is probably one of the worst laws we have actually on the books, I think, is the basic anti-dumping laws, something I've written about with Phil Swagel some years ago. So I'm sure that Lael Brainerd, who I taught as a student at Harvard, I'm sure she understands the economics of this. But I also understand she and her colleagues understand the politics of this. And the politics are that Pennsylvania is a swing state, and then the steelworkers are important. And so given their political calculation, promoting the steel industry is sort of the right policy. So those are some of many, many examples of how the political process can get this right. And just remember, the intelligent, benevolent social planner, the most dangerous person in economics. Thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Greg, very much. I'm going to look if Ramsey ever appears in any of your articles, but let's leave that aside. Next panelist is Dani Rodrik.
Let me say, while I get this going, that actually I agree with Greg that the intelligent, benevolent social planner doesn't exist. And I'm actually grateful that it doesn't exist because I owe my job to the fact that if it existed, there wouldn't be schools of public policy where you actually have to teach students to be a little bit more intelligent about public policy. But I guess unlike Greg, I believe that you can actually do that. Let me start by maybe just saying, making the historical point that actually industrial policy as one of the advantages of being the final speaker is that so many of the points that I was going to make have already been made. So I can mostly sort of go through a lot of these things, and maybe my presentation will be more of a reflection on many of the things that have been said, rather than new points necessarily. Although I will close with a couple of points that I think are additional. One is just maybe the obvious point to many of you that there is a long historical tradition for industrial policy in economics, and also in actually American economic policy. Of course, one of the fathers of industrial policy, intellectual fathers, is Alexander Hamilton. His report on manufacturers is still actually a great piece to read on how to foster manufacturing. Of course, the Smithian Ricardian tradition has always been parallel to this sort of Hamiltonian and Listian tradition that took a very different view about whether markets would allocate resources dynamically, appropriately, and whether government intervention to foster structural change was required or not. And of course, as people have mentioned now, this President Biden has adopted industrial policy fully. But it is the case that industrial policy was always there, even when the U.S. government wasn't talking about it explicitly. In fact, I give examples of because, President Reagan was very heavily involved in promoting steel and autos by putting trade restrictions, was involved in saving Harley Davidson for a while, sort of just very firm specific trade policies. Thatcher, went pleading Japanese foreign investors to come in and set up auto plants in the UK. Pinochet, of all people, heavily subsidized forestry products, and has been actually one of Chile's industrial policy successes, which was promoted by an avowedly a very liberal, economically liberal leader. So, one of the arguments that actually, if I think that economists should take seriously is that whether we agree or not on desirability of this industrial policy is something governments always practice, and maybe there are ways that we can tell them that they can do it a little bit better or a little bit less worse, because it's always been there. So the definition of it has already been talked about. This would be my definition. I guess unlike Laura, I don't think it's difficult to define industrial policy. I think it's policies that have very explicit sort of sectoral or preferences. It's always, it's always promoting something. And then the part of industrial policy that is left unsaid, which of course is our job as economists always to point out. So if you're promoting something, you're necessarily taxing some other thing. So that's really the part that is often left unsaid. Multiple objectives, obviously today, and very diverse set of policy instruments and patterns of conditionality and so forth. And this is a point that I want to come back to, because as economists, it's natural for us to look for very distinct quantifiable measures of intervention, and those tend to be tax incentives, subsidies, trade protection, and most empirical studies have to focus on those because you're just trying to get some quantifiable measures of intervention. But one of the points that I'll make is that actually some of the most effective modes of industrial policy are not subsidies, but different types of assistance to firms. And that we need to take when we think about industrial policy, we need to think broadly in terms of variety of different types of supports, including very customized or highly specialized public inputs like workforce training or particular pieces of specific infrastructure and so forth. These also have been talked about, the basic theoretical rationales in terms of externalities, in terms of coordination failures. And I think, again, adding this notion of sort of missing public inputs. When we think about public inputs, we typically think about horizontal public goods. But in practice, of course, many of the public inputs that firms need or any cluster needs are highly specific to the needs of that cluster. Such as specialized workforce skills or sector-specific regulations or standards or particular pieces of technology or infrastructure. So that creates an additional rationale, economic theoretical rationale for industrial policy. And I think this point on this slide has come across. So economists don't disagree about the presence of these very strong economic theoretical rationales for industrial policy. Where industrial policy has become controversial and typically viewed adversely by economists is by sort of these two arguments. Essentially, one is the informational argument that governments can never pick the winners. They don't have the adequate information. The other is the political arguments that even if they had, there wouldn't be the political incentives for them to do the right kinds of things. But but the nature of these arguments has always been a sort of a hand-waving kind. It's not like we've actually established these arguments make industrial policy a bad thing. It's just that we sort of think corruption and politics is always around, and so we do a lot of hand-waving and maybe bring up examples from here and there where they seem to have operated to suggest that industrial policy, despite its strong economic rationale, should not be carried out in practice because of these hand-waving kind of things. So this is really where the debate has always been, and this is what has been, what has bothered me about the debate on international, on industrial policy, is that has never been about its economic merits, but around very sharply conflicting priors about how it would be carried out in the real world, with sort of one side saying, look at, how you can overcome these informational and political problems, and others pointing out to East Asia saying, look, obviously they did it. Their circumstances weren't particularly favorable. It's very hard to disagree that at least some of their successes was due to industrial policy. So one might have hoped that evidence or systematic evidence might help us resolve this question. And as Réka mentioned, so not going to go through the literature here, that the more recent generation or the most recent empirical literature on industrial policy generally comes to sort of more favorable conclusions about the effectiveness. I don't mean the economic benefits, the effectiveness in the sense of if the government intervened to get some sector going or some set of investments increased, did those results actually take place? That's far from a full cost-benefit analysis of this. But this recent literature does suggest that there are many instances, from regional policies to technology policies to innovation policies to investment policies to sectoral policies, where such effects have taken out. I just want to sort of mention one critical point here about how limited, in fact, the empirical evidence will ultimately play a role in the actual policy debate. Because in a lot of this empirical evidence, what we're trying to do is extract some exogenous component of industrial policy and figure out whether the causal effects went one way or another. So whether we're doing through IV or we're doing it through some historical experiment where we argue that the intervention was, or the shock was exogenous, that's never really going to resolve the key debate on industrial policy, because if you find out the exogenous component of industrial policy actually produced some desirable results, then the critic is going to say, well, of course, because my worry is not about some randomly sampled subsidies. My worry is that, just as Greg was saying before, that these subsidies were going to be used for politically motivated reasons. And it's that kind of endogenous industrial policy that's going to be harmful. If, on the other hand, you find that these randomly sampled subsidies did not produce a positive effect, then the supporter of industrial policy will say, well, of course, I'm not saying that I'm not proposing that the government should randomly, sprinkle subsidies throughout the economy. I'm saying that they should do it consciously where those externalities are, and I actually believe that the externalities can be determined. So for that reason, I think there is a little bit of, I think we should not be too ambitious about how much this empirical literature can inform the actual debate. But it is the case that sort of the more recent literature should at least give us, a set of updated priors that you might have had from the literature in the 80s and 90s that was purely correlational and suggested that more subsidies were correlated with worse performance. Okay, all right. So I think the productive debate really here is whether you, like me, think that there is really a role for industrial policy, or whether you think there is no role for industrial policy, but governments will do it nevertheless. The question becomes sort of really the relevant question that I think we should be talking a lot more about, is the how question, that is how to do the industrial policy. And I think there's a lot of work that looks at the evolving practice of industrial policy that I think is quite insightful. And I'm just going to suggest some of these differences from the traditional way that economists have thought about industrial policy, and just highlight some of the features, and I'll give very briefly some examples. One is really that the notion of sort of that, all of these sort of more recent efforts at industrial policy that sort of, is different from the traditional top-down subsidy-based policies are really are based on the notion that actually state capacity is not a given. It's endogenous. So this is an issue that has kept coming up. I think, that the state capacity is something that is built over time. You learn by doing. Bureaucrats learn by actually how you can do things over time. So I think one notion that has to be relaxed is this notion that there is this given thing called state capacity. Instead, think about, how you can build capacity when you think of something as a priority. Second, on the role of incentives, this is something I said at the outset, that a lot of the best kind of industrial policies, involve not directly subsidies or tax incentives, but what one might call the sort of a broader portfolio of services to businesses, and they could include marketing, management, training, technological assistance, customized training, particular infrastructure, and so forth. And there's a lot of experimentation going on with varieties of different types of conditionality, selection criteria, and so forth. So this is a much richer conception of industrial policies. Let me give you just three concrete examples of what these types of industrial policies actually look like in the real world. One is some of the more successful place-based policies in the United States. So an example would be the Right Place in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And this is a kind of a local economic development effort that's sort of cross-sectoral, that brings firms with workforce trainers and community colleges and the officials, local development officials together to essentially coordinate around a set of public inputs and attraction efforts, both to get foreign investors to come in and also to retain investment. So here, the job that is being performed is largely one of coordination and prioritization, and also sort of providing a sort of vision for different types of industries. Second example would be a very different example of innovation at the frontier. This would be the ARPA model, which has been generally quite successful in the United States. Of course, this is industrial policy in the sense that it is really ARPA, DARPA, and then ARPA-E, ARPA-H. These are really betting on different technologies day by day, taking there, and but they're operate in a very different part of the economy, but along somewhat similar lines of essentially very collaborative with iterative criteria to determine success and failure and revise original goals accordingly. And then third, a very, very different examples from a very different part of the world. This is example of promoting services employment in ride sharing in Haryana state in India, where the state government has teamed up with Ola and Uber to get them to hire more drivers in return for sharing their, in return for the state sharing their roles of unemployed youth, and when needed, sort of revising and updating regulations in ways that will enable these firms to be able to expand. And I've just run out of time. I have more comments, but maybe we can discuss. Yeah.
If I could ask the panelists. Well, thank you. I think what we'll do now is allow each of the panelists to respond or for 2-3 minutes, very short, on to other people on the panel. And then we'll open up to general discussion and the panelists can intervene. Thank you. So we can just start from right to left, I guess.
Oh, I was actually very happy with it. I don't have much to say right now.
So as Joe Biden says, take the win, take the win. Laura.
I was gonna say something, but I think we're getting paid, and so.
No, I'll just whisper it quietly.
No, it's gonna come in trouble. So it's always very hard to do industrial policy after Dani Rodrik because he's very eloquent. But as I said, because I do know it exists everywhere, and because I know there is a bias by firms and governments to do it, I actually think we should hold the line even before, because it will happen. And just a comment, I actually think the reason why Pinochet did the forest is because his family had the license.
Yeah. I agree with most of what was said. I want to say just one brief comment about Danny's whether and how. I agree with him that whether they're going to do industrial policy, yeah, the politicians are probably going to do it because they really enjoy doing it. They like it. I'm not sure that therefore we should pivot to how, because if you think they're not going to listen to us on the weather question, what makes you think they're going to listen to us on the how question? So I think we need to, I think we need to express a degree of healthy skepticism, even though I admit their cases, and I personally think the national defense one is probably the strongest right now in the current environment. Even their cases when I think it is probably called for.
Well, I mean, I would think that they're more likely to listen to us if, they think that we're likely, to be helpful than if we just completely rule it out. But that's a question of judgment. You've been in the government, I haven't. So, but I want to say something actually that was not in my notes, and it's unrelated to, well, related to some of the things that I was said. But I mean, I think my main concern with the CHIPS Act or to the current U.S. industrial policies is that it's the notion, and I think quite rightly, Laura mentioned that a lot of the reason that countries do industrial policy is to generate jobs in particular sectors. And my concern is that sort of old-fashioned fostering of manufacturing, especially high-end manufacturing, semiconductors, is one of the most inefficient way you can imagine for actually creating jobs, even if they're going to be sort of better jobs than the average. And just to give, I think, Greg, you mentioned the investment in Arizona, right? You did,
Yes,
right?
yes.
The TSMC investment in Arizona. So that's like three, it's supposed to be ramped up to 3 fab plants and the total cost of investment is $65 billion. And those 3 plants are going to generate about 6,000 jobs, right? That's $10 million per job. Now, you might believe that's a good thing to do for national security reasons and for other reasons. But this is like one of the worst ways of trying to create good jobs, and sort of that's, I think, the same argument goes for, I think, a lot of developing countries, that I think industrialization and manufacturing is simply not doing the job. They're no longer labor-absorbing sectors. So I think, well, to the extent that we should care about, and here I think I disagree with Laura, I do think that creating good jobs, middle-class jobs, should be an objective of government policy, but it's simply not going to happen through manufacturing and industrialization, and that's going to require very different types of industrial policy. That's why I gave the Haryana state example in India, which is sort of basically a kind of industrial policy for services.
I completely agree with that. There's among the misperceptions that a lot of policymakers have is that in some sense manufacturing jobs are better than service jobs. And you hear politicians say we don't make things anymore, as if services, like what we do, is a waste of time, right? And I agree with Dani completely. I mean, manufacturing is declining everywhere. Actually, Robert Lawrence gave a great talk about this at the Kennedy School just a couple of weeks ago. He's writing a book on this topic. So the idea that manufacturing is the future of any economy is probably just wrong.
Just one clarification. I think also the difference is we have different definitions of what industrial policy is. So for me to bring everyone to the same room and coordinate, and this is what you do, and this is what you do, I don't call that industrial policy. For me, that is government job. I do call industrial policy that I am selecting a firm, a sector allocation.
Well, I mean, I think when, government, I think even when you're deciding on sort of, government bandwidth is limited, right? Just like the subsidy. So I think when governments decide, which sector, so Costa Rica, right? I mean, you know it, obviously, but, and I think a lot of the success, so Intel received a lot of subsidies, but probably that was just what made it, that wasn't the only thing that made Costa Rica, Intel choose Costa Rica. But I think the more recent successes of Costa Rica in terms of, for example, medical instruments, right? A lot of that is just the ability of the government to respond to the needs of these firms by saying, not subsidies, right? Again, it sort of fits what I was saying at the end, not subsidies, but saying what you need specialized workforce. Well, we're just going to be investing in the workforce that you need. Now, that's not education, it's not horizontal. Now you might say, well, it's not industrial policy because it's investing in education, but it's investing in training for a very, very specific kind, for a very specific type of firms. And so it is making a choice, some sectoral choices about that. Now, perfectly fine, don't call it. I don't think industrial policy is a relevant term anyhow, because I don't think manufacturing is the future, as Greg said. But there is something about this sort of approach where you're actually dealing with firms as opposed to just keeping them at arm's length, which is, I think, the major dividing line here.
Yeah, of course.
First of all, people don't know that semiconductors was already in Costa Rica before Intel. What was complicated about Intel was the size. Like, it was just a big firm. But the reason why all of these firms were going is, fair enough, we had invested in universities. Again, semantics. I think that is a universal policy. It is true that then when they came, we realized we need more engineers. But again, I think engineers can go many places. In fact, if you're an engineer in Costa Rica, you have a job as soon as you say you're going to be an engineer. We did things. We fixed the road that went to the airport, but it's not in exclusivity to this firm. Everyone can use it. Again, I do think that is the role of government, and it is true that they have 24 hours. One has to choose, but is the choosing between just this one, which it just so happens to be the firm that my family has the rights, or something that you think that others can also benefit. And as I said, I try to look for a definition of IP, and it is very self-defined. People have their definitions. I do like to differentiate the more horizontal from the vertical, but as I said, everyone defines it that would be like this.
Let me just turn to the audience because I have 4 people and I'd like maybe to get, if there's time, my own question. But let's start with Alan Orbach, who is first.
Thanks, Marty. Listening to this back and forth reminds me of the whole discussion of rules versus discretion. And in that context, the social planner behaving optimally will always do better with following discretionary policy rather than any kind of rules, because different things happen and there's always something better that you can do than just following a rule. And the argument for rules in that context was, well, that's, as Greg said, that's social planner is. So you might get too much inflation, or depending on the model, something you don't want. And I think that suggests that the way I, at least I frame this in my own mind, is that it's a place where you place the bar in terms of deciding that industrial policy is okay. And it's a trade-off between accepting the imperfect decisions that politicians are going to make and saying, well, fine, they're going to make wrong decisions, but this is a really important case. There's a really big market failure here. Maybe this is Operation Warp Speed or something like that. And then we can say, yeah, that was a great idea because however high the bar was, it was above the bar, even if the subsidies were directed in not exactly the right way. But I think that's sort of in terms of where an economist should be on this, is to say there should be a bar somewhere. And just saying, yeah, go ahead, do whatever you want, because industrial policy is okay, or you're going to do it anyway, I think is sort of a cop-out. And I guess the other point I would make is that where the bar should be depends on political institutions. Rent-seeking, capture, and all that stuff is going to be different across different countries. And so where the bar should be, whether we feel how comfortable we should feel with governments undertaking this industrial policy should depend on where we live. And so that it's not a clear black and white answer, but on the other hand, it can be informed by what we know about how well these things tend to work.
Thank you. Next question, Bob King.
So Robert King, Boston University. I think this is a fascinating topic that is being discussed. And what I would like to do is encourage the people who are studying this and writing summaries, perhaps advocating for it, to come up with sharply focused examples that illustrate some principles that can help us think things through. And so I noticed on one of the slides that there was a reference to the Apollo program as an example of industrial policy. I mean, that's a clear case where the government decided it wanted to do something. It went out and spent money. There have been debates long ago about whether or not there were important spillovers of that activity, and if so, how to quantify them. And it also would then naturally lead into consideration of, are there continuing reasons now that the private sector has shown its willingness to engage heavily in that area, or should we have industrial policy in the way of subsidizing SpaceX?
John Lake.
John Leahy. So I spent earlier this week listening to a policymaker rant about how AI was going to destroy all the jobs in the world and that something had to be done. And I was trying to fit it into any of these buckets here, except for jobs. Laura's one. I mean, national defense, AI probably being good at it might be helpful. Technological advance, AI might be helpful. I was just wondering, but this is a pressure that's going to come. The pressure was there. He wants to do something, but he doesn't know what the externality is. He doesn't know who the winners and who the losers are. He just knows that millions of jobs are going to be destroyed, and this is bad.
He must have listened to Jon Stewart the other night.
Yeah.
Jim Stock.
Yeah, this is great. A quick comment, a comment and a question. So the comment is quick on the Inflation Reduction Act that Réka and Greg raised. I think it's worth keeping in mind that at least from a dollar spent perspective, most of that was just an extension of pre-existing tax credits that went back to the 2000s. So from a political economy perspective, it was old-fashioned self-interest by those industries that were getting the tax credits combined with the climate progressives who saw that as a vehicle. So that's just some nuance. I think the question is close to Bob's question about how are we supposed to be evaluating these? So it's not enough simply to note that the Inflation Reduction Act is a lot of battery plants being built in the United States. So at least it's doing that. If it wasn't doing that, then it really wouldn't be successful. I thought some of the big issues were more like, what are the general equilibrium effects? What are the effects on long-term growth? So if we're picking these specific industries, is that going to be slowing down productivity growth and invention and so forth, and in the long run? And anecdotes are okay, but I mean, how do we think about systematic evaluation here? And I suppose I should have an answer, but at least we have review article writers up on the panel, so I'd be interested to get their thoughts.
Well, does anybody want to respond to that right now, or we can come back after all the questions? If yeah, right. I think Rick was next, correct?
Bye. Oh. Two things. One is, I think Laura raised this, which is politicians really focused on jobs. And I think if you look at bad industrial policy, it's usually focused on jobs. The issue should be about what do we do about economic growth, which in the long run will create jobs. But the focus on jobs that Dani mentioned, I think is probably, if you actually did a taxonomy, I think would indicate that the really bad industrial policies are exactly ones focused on jobs. The second issue is, Réka, you haven't talked much, so I'll ask you a question. How do you like that? So you talked about state capacity. And I just didn't understand what you meant by that. It's really critical. So when I think about what happened in East Asia, one of the key things that the export-oriented policy did was it actually changed institutions. That's maybe what you mean by state capacity, but maybe you mean something else. So can you just, in order for me to understand what you were saying, can you just elaborate what you mean by state capacity in a positive way? Because there's also bad state capacity too. So.
Want to handle it now?
Sure. Yeah, so I went over that real quick, but by state capacity, I think what I mean is the ability of the state to actually implement the programs that it designs. So one great example of what goes wrong when you don't have that state capacity, we have this example of Thailand. Thailand is trying to do export-oriented industrial policy. They know from the Koreans that one of the things they need to do is export discipline. The Thai can't collect, they don't have the administrative capacity to collect statistics on the firms that they're subsidizing. They don't know what these firms are doing. So how on earth are they going to be figuring out, you know, whether this firm should get a subsidy tomorrow and we should be revoking the subsidy from this firm because they're not performing. So I think when state capacity, I think it's very important because on the one hand, state capacity is a constraint, but of course, state capacity is endogenous and it also becomes an investment. So here is where I think you need to work today within the constraints of the state capacity that you have. If you don't have the administrative capacity to collect statistics on the firms that you're trying to promote, then this is probably not the type of industrial policy that you should be doing. That doesn't mean that you can't develop this state capacity over time. So I realize I'm taking a lot of time, but let me give you one example. The Department of Energy Loan Programs Office, which I think is something potentially that you are alluding to, that was, I believe, set up under the Obama administration. They've been dispersing a lot of these green tech loans from 2008. They made the ill-fated decision to fund Solyndra. At the same time, they were also funding Tesla. So, you know, who knows what actually the return on their entire portfolio has been. But one of the things that's happening under IRA is that they're investing in state capacity. The New York Times had really good reporting where they were talking about how they were expanding their employees tenfold. And they're actually bringing, at least this is what the New York Times claims, they're bringing the best people in the industry to work there. One of the firms that they're lending to claims is that actually the big thing when you get one of these DOE loans is not necessarily the loan that you're getting, but you're getting the seal of approval from the most sophisticated lender in the market today. So, you know, I think the last thing I'll say, and I will really stop now, but when we talk about sort of whether we should be giving our money to the public venture capitalist or the private venture capitalist, let's remember that private venture capital also funds things like Theranos. So, you know, the standard that we hold the government to should be a standard that we're also sort of holding the private sector to. Of course, the government is going to make mistakes. In fact, the entire design of the venture capital market is that you're not making a profit on every single loan that you're making, on every single bet that you're making. I've seen very few examples where we're evaluating entire portfolios as opposed to sort of using Solyndra as the example that, of course, the government can't do this right.
We're running out of time, so we have 3 questions. So not to cut anyone off, but try and be brief. Jan?
John's nice and perfect. Yeah, I wanted to react to something that Greg said. He rightly said that there's no benevolent social plan, but on the other hand, I think it's also true that there's no perfect free market. And I think, I mean, I'm saying something super obvious, but I think it's not, you know, conducive to productive debate to be trying to have a debate in terms of blacks and whites. I mean, this debate has to be in terms of shades of gray. There are major market failures in all kinds of ways, but also the government is imperfectly marked all kinds of ways. The market is good at certain things, the government is good at certain things, and we need to be having this debate in a shade of gray kind of way. I mean, one example is you know, financial frictions. I think there's a lot of evidence that financial frictions are sometimes very important. That doesn't mean that the government should just fund everything, but you know, there are circumstances. You know, the most extreme example is a banking panic, where I think there's pretty solid agreement that the government should act as a lender of last resort. That's just the most extreme example, but you know, there were lots of other companies that were also under a lot of strain during that time, like Réka was talking about, the same program that funded Solyndra, funded Tesla, and you know, just has been instrumental in moving forward technical change in the green energy sphere since then. So, you know, I really think we need to have a debate in a shade of gray.
Do you see the latest
Let-
quarterly report?
Let's go to Ricardo.
The debate on Mr. policies has happened in this panel is often in terms of directing towards sectors or places, sector-based policies or place-based policies. But I'd like to have the panel react to the extent to which industrial policy is rather size-based. It's often that policymakers will say, we need to make something big. Some existing firm, we need to make it big. It often comes in debates about national champions. We need to be. It's not that we don't have semiconductor in America, we need to be the biggest creative of very large. And this is especially true in smaller countries where this comes up a lot. We need to have like champions that the politician that you go summit and say proud we're the #1 or something. I think this has already been in many ways, even though you didn't mention it explicitly, it showed up in some of what you said, like when Laura mentioned Intel. Intel was just big, and that's why I got attention. When Dani talks about the bandwidth, well, politicians end up picking 5 things, and they want to pick really the big ones. Or when Greg or Réka talk about lobbying in policy capacity, well, it's the existing firms that lobby. Don't go and create something and say, we need even more money so I get big. Réka talks about some capacity. Well, yeah, you can't go and pick one, so you pick the guy who's at hand, and he just wants to grow. Now, on the other side of the Atlantic, the EU, the big concern in the last years in debate has been, if you look at unicorns or innovation, venture capital, Europe has created roughly its share of innovative firms. When you look at our size in terms of universities and just skilled workforce. And yet it seems like almost all of them, once they get to a stage of growth, they move to Delaware and they get venture capital here, and therefore all the unicorns are based in the US, even though so many of them were created in Europe in some way. That may be, I think that's mostly true actually, some of it. And so a lot of the debate has been how do we create scale? And that has led to, and I think I'm going to support, right, that that's really starting to distort the political debate in a very strong way. In that the big thing in Europe now is, look, we were suckers because we listened to economists about competition. The Americans let monopolies set in. We just have to let monopolies in. Mario Draghi 2 days ago gave a very important speech saying, yeah, Mario Draghi is saying we really have to suspend any competition, which has been too tough at it in some way. That's allow for a lot of growth. That has led to, again, a lot of now lobbying and emphasis on let's support the chemical industry in Germany. These big guys, whose energy is not expensive, but they're big, and we need to make them bigger. If they get bigger, they're large. So if I could have all of you comment on just how do we reconcile on the size side, not picking winners, but just how big is too big? How do you think about competition? How do you think about monopoly?
Before we get to Larry Kolikoff, that was a pretty specific question. Does anybody want to comment on it?
Not all of
Yes, and if you feel strongly about responding.
The one thing we haven't talked about is generally the trust policy, which the Biden administration has been much more activist on. Lena Khan has been very active, has a sort of different, more expansive view of antitrust policy. That's a whole other, that could be next year's panel, but I think that's.
Not an idea.
I think, but I mean, obviously, it dovetails for sure. I would say, by the way, the one thing I don't, in reading about the semiconductor industry, is there are tremendous economies of scale. It's very hard not to be big. You can't like open up a semiconductor manufacturing plant in your backyard. You've got to be big, and that's why it's very hard once somebody becomes dominant.
Anybody else?
No, my last comment was about that, the fact that the US now unleashed the Kraken means that it has become precisely what you're saying. Like everyone is gonna throw everything at everything. And if you're small open economy, it's scary because we don't have that much money to buy
Larry?
everything.
Larry?
Larry from the, so it strikes me, you know, in the world of taxes, we have this thing called, the treasury puts out this calculation, that they used to call tax expenditure, showing the cost of these different subsidies, tax code. And I wonder whether there should be something like that. You know, we have this thing with steel. Does this mean that the price of construction and building a house, you know, could we quantify the cost of the Americans of that, or the cost of the Chinese on U.S. soybean to can economists somehow offset this tendency by looking at specific case studies and saying, you know, it's called so many benefits. We have to talk about the incidents and if that's and clarify that. Maybe that would change the reduce the number of targets.
So there is work already that shows that the Trump tariffs were paid by US consumers.
What is it? Okay. So
Reading, Amity, Weinstein.
a lot.
Yes, it's All of them, like all of them was paid by US consumers.
Let me just close with just one observation about something that I happen to know about, which is a very, quote, successful industrial policy, but it's not so obvious. And that's high tech in Israel, right? Which is often viewed as the ultimate success of, and many countries have tried to reproduce it and have not been able to, partly for the comments that Laura raised, which is Israel had particular advantages in high tech. But if you really dig down deeper, it was cyber. And as they move forward, what they're finding out is they're not ready to do AI and they're falling behind, right? And interestingly, two other last observations, created very few jobs, which has created a huge backlash socially in Israel, because a lot of the things, the ideas get invented there, and then the actual implementation is abroad. And then finally, they had very specific institutions which involve partnerships that look like joint venture capital that one might be able to learn something about. But they weren't implemented in other countries for political reasons. Anyways, with that, let me thank the panelists, unless anyone has anything to add. And cocktails away.